Something you'll notice as you're walking through the Bible, especially as you're walking through the Old Testament through the New, is something which Carl Newman calls the development of doctrine. And it's not as if God's truth changes, right? God's truth is always eternal and unchangeable. But at the same time, our understanding of God's truth changes and evolves over time. Not unlike how one's understanding of a particular diamond might change and evolve over time based on how that person sees that diamond shining in the light as he or she is turning that diamond again in that same light. So to use a really easy example, think about the subject of loving our enemies. And so in the context of the Gospel of Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord says, "You have heard it said to you, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." And so again, a really striking example of the development of doctrine over time. But all that said, perhaps the most interesting example of the development of doctrine that we find in the context of the Bible deals with the subject of the problem of evil. And so the problem of evil can be defined in all sorts of different ways, but perhaps the most succinct way to define this particular issue is to frame it as such. God is said to be all good and all powerful, and yet evil exists in the world. We see this in the world, we see this in our very selves. And so therefore it would seem to be the case that God is not all good and or he is not all powerful. And that in a nutshell is the problem of evil. So in response to this particular question or issue, I think it's really important to clarify right off the bat that evil is not a thing in the world. God did not create evil. Evil, to kind of frame it philosophically speaking, is a privation. It's an absence of something which should be there. And so, for example, illness is the absence of health. A cavity is the absence of teeth, right? And so, again, here's something which should be there, which is not there, but more to the point, God does not create evil. Evil is the absence of some good which should be there, but actually is not. But more to the point, there was a distinct development of doctrine when it comes to the problem of evil in the minds of the holy people of God as they moved from the Old Testament to the New. And so, for example, for the longest time in the context of the Old Testament, there seemed to be this undue emphasis on personal sin being a causative factor when it came to bringing about evil in the context of this world. And you find this, for example, in the context of the Gospel of John chapter 9, the story of the man born blind. And so basically what happens is that early on in the story, the disciples of Jesus, they're still laboring under this Old Testament understanding of personal sin being a causative factor when it comes to evil in the world. As a result of which they asked the Lord, why was this man born blind? Was it because his parents sinned or is it because he sinned? And so in a certain sense, if you think about it, it feeds into this notion of bad karma. And so again, the only reason why I'm blind, for example, is because I did something wrong or my parents did something wrong. But of course, the Lord responds in the context of the same story by saying to his disciples that the reason why this man was born blind was not because he sinned, and it wasn't even because his parents sinned, but rather this thing was permitted, this circumstance was permitted such that God's works might be revealed through him. And obviously this speaks to the power of God's permissive will. And so often in the context of Christian theology, we talk about God's active will, where he actively wills things to happen, but also, again, more to the point, his permissive will, where he allows things to happen. And obviously the takeaway message as it pertains to the problem of evil is that God is so good and God is so powerful that if he permits any sort of evil to exist in this world, big or small, it's such that he might bring about a greater good. Okay, now on the face of it, that might sound kind of relatively easy and straightforward, but let me kind of qualify that particular statement of doctrine by giving you two practical bits of advice. And so first of all, it's really important to recognize that even though it's obviously really easy to give a tight philosophical answer to the problem of evil from the Christian perspective, that's not really what people need, pastorally speaking, when they themselves are going through suffering and death and wrestling with the problem of evil. In other words, what they need at that particular moment is not so much an intellectual solution. What they need is a pastoral solution. And so the example that comes to mind is this pastoral distinction between problems on the one hand and mysteries on the other. And so perhaps we might say that problems are essentially issues which have relatively easy and straightforward solutions. And so, for example, the light bulb was burnt out, so what do? We just changed out the light bulb. Easy problem, easy solution. But that's not the case when it comes to mysteries. And so, for example, mysteries are things like love, suffering, and death. And the thing you have to remember when it comes to mysteries is that you must never treat a mystery like a problem. And so, for example, let's say there's a funeral setting and there's a friend of yours who is wrestling with the mysteries of suffering and death at the same time. The last thing you want to do in that particular circumstance is simply quote to them the philosophical answer to the problem of suffering, saying to them some variation of like, look, the only reason why you're going through this thing is because God's permitting a greater good, so That's how you're supposed to think, that's how you're supposed to feel, and that should be the end of that. If you do that, chances are the person in question will say an unkind word and perhaps even punch you in the face, in which case you'll know firsthand what it's like to wrestle with a mystery. But more to the point, what you want to do in that particular circumstance, again, when your friend is going through the mystery of suffering and death, you need to let them go through the mystery. You can't do it for them. You can journey with them and solve problems as they arise, like, feeding the kids or helping with funeral arrangements, but they have to go through it. They have to go through the mystery of suffering and death as you journey with them with care and attention and love. And so the example that comes to mind is this movie directed by Clint Eastwood called $1 Million Baby, which also stars Hilary Swank. And so basically in the context of the film, Hilary Swank plays this young girl who's basically grown up in poor circumstances in trailer parks, who has been given up by all manner of people and society, who suddenly realizes she has this talent to become this professional boxer. And she rises up the ranks and she eventually has this title fight, in the context of which she has this accident and is subsequently paralyzed. And this gives rise to this really interesting scene near the end of the film where Hilary Swank's character is talking to Clint Eastwood's character, who's basically her trainer. And she basically asks him to help her die, because of course she can't do it by herself, so she basically needs his help to kill her. And obviously this gives rise to a certain moral dilemma in the mind of the Clint Eastwood character, and he basically fails the test, right? And so he ultimately decides to kill his former protege. But looking back on that particular scene, the main error on the part of the Clint Eastwood character, besides the fact that he basically euthanizes this girl that he loves, is the fact that he misconstrues the issue. And so basically what he does, he essentially confuses the mystery of suffering and death with a problem. And so he thinks that the pressure is on him to come up with a convincing intellectual solution as to why this girl might live. Whereas in reality, what this girl actually needs in that circumstance is a friend. She needs someone to show her that she is loved, and she is valued, and she is cherished. Not simply through words, but through action. And again, that's obviously something that's not fully recognized in the context of the film, but hopefully it's something that we remember going forward in the future. Okay, but that brings us to the second bit of practical advice that I want to give with regards to this issue of the problem of evil, which is basically to say this. Even though it's true that, again, God permits evil to bring about a greater good, basically don't hold your breath. Don't hold your breath waiting to understand exactly why God is permitting evil to exist, whether we're talking about the world at large or in your own particular life. That was never part of the deal. You were called to trust and completely surrender to God's providential designs, all the while being perfectly content to have this particular situation shrouded in darkness and again completely beyond your own personal understanding. The late John Paul II talks about this particular issue in a really beautiful and profound sort of way, when he says basically that when it comes to suffering in the world, God will never give you an intellectual answer as to why you're suffering. He'll never say like you're suffering because of this and that reason in a clear and again intellectual sort of way. Instead, what you'll realize through prayer is that God is actually calling you to receive this moment as a vocation, to receive this moment as a vocation to participate in God's salvific designs by bearing some small piece of the cross. But you see, what's interesting is that the late Holy Father goes on to say that when you recognize this vocation and you correspond again to the invitation to bear some measure of God's salvific cross, your suffering will not go away. It won't even diminish. And you won't, again, receive an intellectual understanding as to why exactly you're suffering. At the same time, there will be a deeper understanding that there is meaning and there is purpose. In a certain sense, you come to realize, experientially speaking, as opposed to simply in your own mind, that truly all things work together for the good for those who love the Lord. Okay, one final example, and I'll kind of end with this. So this is an example from my own life, actually. And so basically back in 1996, my father died of liver cancer after having been sick for many, many years. And as my dad was coming to the end, I remember two priests in particular being really kind and generous to him and to our family. And so one priest came and gave him all the different sacraments, right? So he baptized him because my dad wasn't baptized before, gave him the sacrament of confirmation, gave him the anointing of the sick, and the apostolic pardon. And then secondly, there was another priest who was helping us to arrange the funeral. And he basically said to us that he would waive the funeral fee, the recommended donation for the funeral, if we would try our best to go to Mass in the future, because he discovered while talking to us that we weren't going to Mass on a regular basis. And this whole episode with all its constituent elements was obviously really impactful on me and my family. So much so that when it came to applying to the seminary, when they asked me what was the best thing to happen to you and what was the worst thing, I said it was the same thing. It was my father's death, right? So it was the best thing to happen to us because it kind of brought us back to the faith. But at the same time, it was the worst thing to happen to us for obvious reasons. Just to think it through, right? So if we didn't go back to Mass and a regular practice of our faith, clearly I wouldn't have gone to the seminary. Clearly I wouldn't have become a Catholic priest. And clearly I wouldn't be here in my current assignments. Never mind my previous assignments in Oshawa, Brampton, and North York. And more to the point, when I think about my father's death, and when I think about the meaning behind my father's suffering and death, I often think about this thing we're talking about today, this huge scope of the human drama in which we're all playing a small part. I mean, just think about it like this. What can God do simply by having one more priest in the context of the world? What can he do? I've been privileged to see certain instances of that in terms of immediate fruits of doing ministry in the context of the world. But quite honestly, when it comes to the effect of God working in the world through my priesthood, really I have no clue. And it doesn't matter that I have no clue, right? Because it's beyond my pay grade to fully understand the inner workings of God's providential designs. And so given all that, what am I called to do? I'm called to trust. I'm called to surrender again to God's providential designs. And in particular, I got to trust and believe that if God deprives me of the company of my Father, even for a single day, it must be for a greater good. It has to be, right? Because precious in the eyes of the Lord is the death of his faithful. And again, all things work together for the good for those who love the Lord. And may God bless you all.